Hello, that's better. Good afternoon. My name is Jacqueline Bhabha, and I'm delighted to welcome you back to the second part of this conference on confronting evil. We had two very stimulating and I think diverse but complementary sessions this morning, looking both at the sort of conceptual philosophical apparatus for thinking about evil to start with, and then some of the sort of approaches, methodologies, but also findings from psychological research and psychological scholarship on evil. And I think the discussion was really rich and stimulating on a number of vectors. And I just want to point to three, which I think will carry on in the discussion that we're going to have in the course of our panel, which is focused on witnessing evil and is really very decidedly presentist, looking at contemporary harms and contemporary evils, both quotidian and extraordinary. The first point I wanted to make was about definitional matters, and many speakers alluded to this morning, either to say that they were not going to offer a definition or to cover a range of different approaches to evil. And I just wanted to say that from the perspective of international law and human rights law in particular, which is my discipline, we nearly always start with a definition, even though we then try to qualify it or maybe even escape from under it. And so in the human rights arena, there is a very clear sense of evil as defined by international law, which provides a sort of framework for action. It provides a framework for state obligations, and it also provides, if you like, the touch button that was mentioned earlier for people engaged in acts on behalf of their state. So, for example, the Geneva Conventions, which deal with conflict and with international humanitarian law, have very clear specifications of conduct that is considered untenable even in conflict. So it provides combatants, soldiers conducting battle on behalf of their states with a context in which they can avoid and refuse to follow orders which are defined in the definition as evil. Turning from wartime to peace, we also have a fairly clear set of norms about what constitutes evil, and some of those terms have already been mentioned. So torture, genocide, a range of different conducts, I won't go into the detail, which are considered unacceptable and intolerable in any circumstance. So there's no context in which a state can justify tolerating this conduct. So that's really our starting framework. Now, as you hear, and as I'm sure you will also agree, none of these terms are uncontentious, even though they have been agreed by states parties and even though they form part of our international architecture. And this is my second point. Much of the controversy about these terms has centered on their cultural and historical and political provenance. So there's often an accusation, crudely put, of human rights imperialism, the idea that one is exporting a particular normative framework about evil and imposing it on societies, cultures, civilizations which have a very different normative context. And so I think one of the topics that will come up in our discussion this afternoon is to what extent some of our international universal principles are indeed transferable. To what extent is torture always torture or not? To what extent is cruel and inhuman degrading treatment always that? To what extent can states parties exercise discretion in particular circumstances to weigh up situations differently from other states? So my last point really centers on this question of discretion. A lot of the discussion this morning, I think, really posited a somewhat dichotomous division between maybe me and you, or them and us, or evil and not evil. And I want to suggest that most of the work happens in between. How we construe evil in a particular context, how we, either as citizens or as policymakers or as ministers and governments, how we exercise the discretion, weighing up different equities. And that's really where a lot of the business of daily politics happens. So in what circumstances are particular types of conduct intolerable? In what circumstances is it permissible, for example, to deny somebody his Miranda rights because of a question of public security? How do we weigh those situations, and how should we weigh them? So I think those are some of the issues, the sort of general framework, the question of how we interpret it, and then this question of discretion that we'll be discussing this afternoon. We have a wonderful panel, I'm pleased to say, and what I propose to do is to return to the table and then introduce the speakers very briefly, one by one. And I don't know if any of you want to come and stand here, or if you're happy to sit there. But in any event, so we'll start off. The first speaker is sitting to my immediate left, and is Gazmend Kapllani, who is a visiting scholar at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies this year. He is a novelist. And I think he's described himself as a historical novelist, but he will know that better when he speaks to you. And he has a fascinating range of perspectives, really on dictatorship and on the transitions that have been occurring in Europe in the post-Cold War era. He's focused on his native country Albania, but he also deals with one of the main, I think, evils currently confronting Europeans, which is pervasive xenophobia and racism, which he has been personally targeted for, but which he also considers more broadly. So he brings to our discussion both a very personal set of experiences, but also a very interesting scholarly and literary perspective. So Ghazi, thank you so much for joining us. And please look in your program to see a list of his novels.
Thank you very much, Jackie, for this very warm introduction and for the opportunity to be here toward a wonderful audience and to have the opportunity, above all, to learn a lot from what was said till now. I will start by saying that I was looking at Brattle Street yesterday from the window of my studio all day long, and the road was all day long, empty, unchanged, immobile, calm like a cemetery, I'd say. I took pictures of the street from every possible angle. And I have to admit that the emptiness of this street will stay with me for a long time, I think. And this emptiness was like a symbol of the fragility of the good. And where good is not something huge, means in this context banal things like going outside or meeting with a friend. And at the same time I was reading newspapers, trying to be informed, and I learned, among others, that a dozen of people lost their limbs after the marathon terrorist attack, and the doctors say that they have to learn to live again from scratch. And that's the feeling as a novelist that I have sometimes. When we clash or we witness evil, we feel like spiritually amputees, like we have to learn and to rethink from scratch about things that we have got for granted. Witnessing Evil is the title of our panel, and I want to stress the fact that even if evil in the Western cultural context at least have a bold religious connotation, it sounds somehow contradictory that there has been an unprecedented proliferation on description of evil and evildoers in the last century, the 20th century, where secularization of societies and narratives was widely spread. And one of the reasons, I think, it is not only the fact that the 20th century symbolized the age of extremes, like Eric Hobsbawm defined it, but is more the fact that the number of those witnessing evil, the amount of personal narratives and testimonies, is also unprecedented compared with the centuries before. Maybe this is one of the causes that evil which many people witnessed in the 20th century still sounds particular and unprecedented, and still remain a point of reference when we try still to talk or to define or to deal with the many aspects of evil. Now, what is a novelist doing in a conference like this? What can he say, and what better for him to tell a story? So I'll tell a story simply, which is a story I'm working on as I lived the first 24 years of my life under a totalitarian regime in Albania, which resembles very much of the today North Korea. And for some years now, I am trying to investigate the public and private lives of two important protagonists in the history of modern Albania. Enver Hoxha, who was the Albanian communist dictator for 40 years, and Musine Kokallari, who is the first woman Albanian writer who was imprisoned and exiled by the dictator's regime. They have many things in common, although, because they belong to the same generation, which is known in Albania as the generation of the 30s, and they were both raised in the same town. They were close relatives, and they shared the same passion for books. For the need of my investigation, I met with victims and perpetrators of that time in Albania, and the psychological traumas, the silences, and the shame sometimes the victims feel toward their painful stories were not unfamiliar to me, because I had known personally some of them during the communist regime. And moreover, the most interesting thing had to do with the fact that among these victims of the regime were some of his former most prominent supporters, or former instigators and compliers, it was said in the morning panel, which reminds me of Arendt's essay on violence, when she writes that totalitarian domination based on terror turns not only against its enemies, but against its friends and supporters as well. So former instigators and compliers can be turned to be victims of the regime. Many years after the collapse of the regime, I found myself again in Albania doing some research in the beginning on the lifestyle of the instigators and compliers of the regime. And I was surprised to discover, among other things, that books and private libraries played an important role in Hoxha's court. I was astonished by the fact that these guys who systematically destroyed libraries and book collections were also great readers and book collectors themselves. Enver Hoxha himself possessed an astonishing private library with more than 20,000 titles, mainly in French, as he studied in France in the 30s. The private library of the dictator doesn't exist anymore. It has been dismantled into thousands of pieces and totally disappeared, and many of the books were stolen, and many of these books which were stolen from people who came to power after his death. But it was back then that I began to get interested on the private library of the tyrant, as I have an obsession with books. And I was lucky enough to find in the Albanian State Archive all the titles of the books of his private library, and photocopied more than 1,000 pages where these titles were written. And then I decided to go further on my research because actually I wanted to learn more on the relationship of the tyrant to books. And it was then that I crossed a line, the line of the evil, as we would have called it. Because I had to enter and to talk to people who belong to this part of the world which by then and still now I had feared, hate profoundly, and rejected, the world of the perpetrators. Some of these people that I was I wanted to talk to were close relatives. Some others were collaborators. Some others were obedient attendants of the dictator. But this was, so to say, the price that I had to pay for my ambition as a writer. I wanted to write a book. I can speak for hours about the meetings with some of these real characters who in past belonged to the powerful camp of persecutors and executioners. But I will restrain myself in some remarks which really hit me. The first thing was that they struggled really hard to convince me on their human side. They cared very much to show me and that they were good fathers, normal people who loved their children, their husbands and wives, and they loved reading and were passionate of music. Some of them stressed the fact that they have even helped persecuted people in the past. Some of them, or the most of them, had remained still fond of their former master, justifying his deeds by historical facts. For example, Albania had been a country rejected and despised from the West, and the country was destroyed from the Second World War and suffered from a dramatic backwardness. But when our conversation came to their responsibilities during the totalitarian period, then they lost all their good spirit. Even in the case that showed regret from the crimes of the regime, they systematically avoid apologizing. Almost all of them declared ignorance or lack of information about what had happened, or justified everything but saying that they were obeying rules and orders, or evoked the general spirit of that time, which prevailed not only in Albania but all over the world. The spirit of that time was for them something like a physical phenomenon, upon and beyond human will. It is true that sometimes, while talking with them, I imagined them with terror, I should admit, in their previous roles, powerful labor camp guards, sons and daughters of powerful dictators, investigators and prosecutors. But now, without the mantle of power, the protection of that paranoid system, who they had forged, preserved, or blindly obeyed, they felt powerless. Never repented, nevertheless. They were unable to carry any sense of guiltness. Instead, some of them hinted that they felt victims of that European bloody 20th century, where someone had to choose between becoming a Nazi or a communist. Now, I'm aware that perhaps I'm not saying something terribly original here, describing the behavior of some of the perpetrators. The concept of the banality of evil, which was referred here, coined by Hannah Arendt, has helped us a lot to understand the different aspect of evil. I will nevertheless refer to another dimension, to a social dimension, which has been stressed by Tzvetan Todorov, the French-Bulgarian philosopher, in his book Facing the Extreme, where he analyzed the Nazi concentration camps and the Stalinist gulags. And he describes the behavior of the perpetrators in a totalitarian regime as social schizophrenia. I find it very useful, this description of an analysis of Todorov, where he says that in a totalitarian regime, the life is divided into impermeable compartments. I am an executioner, but at the same time, I am a good friend and a good father. And Todorov says that, like the fever that accompanies an illness, fragmentation makes evil possible, even easy. And it is for this reason that fragmentation is an ordinary vice, and I think not only in totalitarian regimes. Nevertheless, I would stress the fact that in order to understand the behavior of the perpetrators and the victims as well, we should go deeper and analyze the hardcore ideological narrative and practice in which they are based and in which contexts they are defined. It's this very ideological narrative that many of the perpetrators refuse to reject by justifying their acts or by pretending to not understand or not know what was going on. Or as Todorov says, we must try to grasp the whole situation, to articulate two propositions which only seem to contradict each other. First, that the crimes are inhuman, but the criminals are not. And second, that some ordinary people committed some extraordinary acts. That's why, once the totalitarian system is in place, the vast majority of the population, people like you and me, are at risk of becoming accomplices in its crimes. That is all it takes. And I think that I took already the 15 minutes, and I have to stop here.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ghazi, for those thoughtful remarks, which really tie us, I think, very well into the conversation we had this morning. So we are moving from the banality of evil to the banality of good to the fragility of good, and it's an interesting transition that we're making. Our second speaker is sitting next to Ghazi is Linn Normand, who is a social scientist and who now teaches and works at Oxford. She did her thesis on, let me read the title of her thesis, investigating the phenomenon of demonization in international politics. And again, referring to the conversation we had this morning about how people positioned on the opposite sides of the Israeli-Palestinian divide can see the same news item as being biased against them. I think this relates very much to some of the points that Linn has looked at in terms of caricatures and stories and accounts which demonize the other. So, Linn, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to your remarks.
Let's see. See if this will work. Can you see it or no? It's connected here, so. There we go. Right, so I'd like to start by thanking the organizers of the conference for giving me the opportunity to present here today. What I am going to be presenting builds on my PhD research on demonization in international politics. My talk is entitled Witnessing Evil, Mutual Demonization in the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. And what it's going to be about is about the manifestations and discourses of evil in this particular conflict, trying to understand the different contexts from which these emerge, and trying to look at some of their effects. I want to come with a disclaimer before I begin my presentation, and that is that I in my presentation use images and cartoons to illustrate what I call the demonization effect. So just to let you know that these are not a reflection of my own personal views. As for the outline, what I'd like to do is to start by giving a historical perspective to demonization by giving some examples, then turning to the specific case of Israel-Palestine, before looking at some of the context behind the demonization, then turning to what I call demonization deadlock effects, and then finally considering the notion of de-demonization in conflict. But before that, I'd like to begin with a story. In April 1998, 3 artists, an Israeli Jew, an Israeli Arab, and a Palestinian, came together to paint a mural. The project was entitled The World Wall, A Vision of the Future Without Fear, and was supposed to stand as a symbol of coexistence over the disputed land. Now, it was a project with noble intentions, but it ended badly. Covering the story in the New York Times, Ethan Brenner dubbed the artist's discord the devil incident. The incident had occurred, he explained, when the Israeli artist painted a characterization of his own people as an angelic figure. The Palestinian, furious at the characterization of the Israelis as the heroes of the story, announced at the unveiling of the artwork that his colleague's creation was in fact, quote, a devil posing in angel's dress, like the Israelis themselves. Now, I begin with this devil incident because it not only demonstrates a microcosm of the tension that exists between Israelis and Palestinians over their disputed land, but above all, it also illustrates an example of what I call demonization. Now, demonization, and I am going to go into definitions here, in the strictest sense, demonization means the act of changing into or giving the characterization of a demon. In this sense, there's two dimensions to the definition. The first one is a literal transformation of an individual being into a demon or a devil, but the second sense is more figurative. It's the act of making someone into a devil or a demon. So in this sense, it's a metaphor, a figure of speech, an externally imposed characterization of your enemy as devil or demon. In this sense, demonization is an accusative process between, on the one hand, the demonizer, those who accuse, and the demonized, the targets of those accusations. More broadly defined, and as I use in my work, demonization involves imposing a moral judgment onto one's adversary and doesn't need to necessarily involve literal characterizations of devils and demons. It means, in other words, in a broader sense, exaggerating the evil of the enemy. Evil is a crucial ingredient for demonization, and the meaning behind the demonic of demonization and evil is hidden in the word itself. And that is that you can clearly see the theological ancestry of these categorical imperatives of morality, where good is by definition what God intends, and evil is the work of the devil. So my interest in this phenomenon began, my background is in international relations, it began by studying seemingly very different international conflicts. And one of the things, as you'll see from the following slide, is this recurrent theme of demonization in international conflict. I'm not presenting this as a fixed chronology here, but here are examples from the 30 Years' War, the Napoleonic Wars, the Second World War, and the Cold War. We can go much further back. In fact, unfortunately, Elaine Pagels isn't here today, but her work looked at demonization in the context of early Christendom. So we can go much, much further back. But this is just to show a visual display of a very consistent trend, and that is this notion that although fought in totally different time periods by different protagonists for apparently different reasons, this theme of good and evil runs like a thread through much of our not only visual history, but in conflicts themselves. So basically, the battle of good and evil here is represented as the one side always being on the right side and the other side being on the wrong side, on the side of the devil. So my research grew out of this curiosity of this historically prevalent and geographically diverse phenomenon. And I asked myself, well, what about today? And here are only a few examples. I'm sure we could brainstorm a lot more. But the two I focus on in my research is, in the first case, the narrative of Great Satan, which was so prominent in post-revolutionary Iran against the United States. And in later years, this notion of the axis of evil, so the policies of rhetorical demonization between the US and Iran. But what I want to focus on in this presentation is the demons in the Israeli and Palestinian conflict. A recent project that I did was to gather examples of demonizations in Israeli and Palestinian discourse. I will be showing you some of these shortly. And what I found is that demonization narratives have appeared, not perhaps surprisingly, in the conflict. So as I turn to the case then, I want to open up with Jesse Jackson, the African-American civil rights activist and Baptist minister, who in 1988 reflected on the hopes of peace between Israelis and Palestinians, and basically comes to the conclusion that there is mutual demonization. And in the examples that I'm going to be showing you are going to be illustrations that I do find evidence for Jesse Jackson's mutual demonization claim. Now, here are only two examples of statements dealing with the theme of demonization in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Here you see how the religious metaphor is used in a political context first in the Knesset document and then by a statement by one of the founders of Hamas, to show how the other side has brought the devil into the Middle East. So both sides here are alluding to this need of expulsion and cleansing. Themes that also appear in this narrative between Israelis and Palestinians is the notion of destruction. With that comes the victimization narratives, the notion of heroism, which we've talked about, revenge, the need for revenge, and on the Palestinian side, as we'll come to later, this notion of land grabbing, occupation, and domination. In this next set of examples, I show these because it shows how demonic terminology isn't just used in the case of waging war, but it also appears in the context of peacemaking. So here we have an example of Yasser Arafat using the demon as an analogy for the settlement constructions, as consuming the peace process, and Ishak Shamir, on the other hand, saying that he'd rather speak to anyone, even the devil himself, but not with a PLO. So here really juxtaposing the evilness of the PLO with the devil. So having shown you some examples of demonization, what I want to do is to move on to looking at some of the different contexts of mutual demonization. I don't want to give you a history of the conflict, but I'm going to show some images that lend themselves to expressing some of the witnessed evils on both sides of the conflict. Frightfully familiar, perhaps. What I want to make as a point in this slide is that demonizing, in the context of Palestinian demonization of Israelis, really has to be understood in the context of their own experiences of occupation and colonialism. Statements that I collected tended to appear in the context of settlement activities, as we saw in the case of Arafat, Israeli military incursions, or house demolitions, just a few examples. Palestinian demonization of Israelis then has to be understood as an expression of anti-colonialism, anti-Zionism, and anti-occupational sentiments. Given this context, we see the meaning of the following quote. Here, the author is using the analogy of the demon to justify the idea that the Israeli body politics is taking over the Palestinian body, causing immense suffering and possessing the Palestinian body. The idea here is to signify this idea of dispossession, of occupation, of the sense of illegitimacy on the part of Israel. Turning then to the Israeli context, the point here is that Israeli demonization of Palestinians has to really be understood in the context of their own experiences of terrorism. Statements appear in the context of, for example, suicide attacks, mortar attacks, particularly in the Second Intifada. We see quite a lot of examples of demonization statements. So terrorism and security concerns are central themes to Israeli demonization. Given this context, again, just an illustration, we start to see the meaning behind the following quote by Ariel Sharon, which is the idea here of this fear of encirclement, this idea that Palestinians are targeting the most vulnerable citizens in society, so women, children, old people, and that there is really this sense here of a coalition of terror and an axis of evil. So here, really the sense of being kind of encircled, the idea of someone willfully seeking harm, and a security threat. So the point I want to make here is that the same speech act of demonization is used to express different evil experiences of the same conflict. Why does this matter? Well, I'd like to move on to the notion of shaking hands with the devil. Now, Bob, you'll probably be very familiar with this because you were part of the inspiration for kind of working on this here at PON. And the idea here is that I argue in my research that it matters, demonization matters when it comes to the resolution of the conflict. In a conflict setting, what I mean by shaking hands with the devil is trying to find an agreement or make peace with a demonized enemy. Now, demonization, I argue, brings with it the rejectionist principle that you simply cannot, it's wrong to negotiate with evil. I'm going to leave this question open because I know it's an important topic for the next panel, but I do want to focus on some of the elements, some of the mechanisms, which I call demonization deadlock. Now, I call them the three scenarios of demonization deadlock. And in the first scenario, what I try to explain is that demonization brings in the notion of the nip in the bud. And that is that essentially, when you demonize the enemy, you prevent any dialogue from taking place in the first place, because the prospect of bargaining with the evil enemy is immoral. Evil has to be vanquished, it can't be negotiated. So what tends to happen is you cut the diplomatic process in the bud, where parties don't even sit together. If they do sit together, what often tends to happen in the context of demonization is we develop this notion of no partner for peace. I don't have time to go into this in the Israeli-Palestinian context, but we are familiar with this terminology in the conflict. And basically what we see here is that by demonization fosters an image of a peace partner as dishonest and illegitimate. So it creates problem in the process in terms of lack of trust. So even if negotiation parties do come to the table, demonization creates a deadlock situation in the process. Finally, with us or against us scenario. This has to do with third-party mediation, and that is that when we tend to quote a conflict in terms of good and evil, we tend to forge a with us or against us mentality. There's this polarization that tends to occur, and in that polarization, what happens is very often it becomes difficult one is forced to choose sides. I want to end, as I come to a close here, with a quote by Avraham Berg, the Labour Minister and former Knesset member, on the importance of demonization. What I argue is that while investigating the presence of demonization is the first step into research, what I'm more interested in is this prospect of de-demonization in conflicts. De-demonization implies bringing the human side back of the enemy, but encouraging the exorcism of international politics without first convincing scholars and statesmen of demonization's existence and implications is a futile exercise. For while the act of demonizing is largely figurative, its consequences may be more real and far-reaching than commonly acknowledged. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Linn, for that very nicely illustrated talk and for really illustrating to us how the possibility for negotiation can get so stuck with what you call mutual demonization. So thank you. That's very interesting. Our last speaker on the panel is a person I've known for longest, our former colleague from the University of Chicago, Rick Shweder, who is a cultural anthropologist and author of many books, including a very influential edited volume together with our current dean of our law school, Martha Minow, called Engaging Cultural Differences, which is a wonderful compilation and a wonderful aid for teaching some of the most tricky questions of cultural difference and negotiation that crop up across disciplines. Rick teaches at the University of Chicago and spans the full spectrum, I think, of social sciences, from psychology through sociology to anthropology, and I think he's known as one of the most prominent exponents of a particular approach to human rights, which really problematizes some of the self-confident attitudes that are often current. So, Rick, thank you very much for joining us, and look forward to your comments.
Well, thank you for that appropriate introduction, especially the last part. The inspiration for this talk is a remark by the anthropologist Clifford Gertz, which goes as follows. The image of a world full of people so passionately fond of each other's cultures that they aspire only to celebrate one another does not seem to me a clear and present danger. The image of one full of people happily apotheosizing their heroes and diabolizing their enemies, alas, does. As we all know, and indeed it's been mentioned many times today, Hannah Arendt covered the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Israel in 1961 for the New Yorker magazine, and then wrote the controversial essay, Eichmann in Jerusalem, where she argued that there was no demonic profundity to Eichmann's character, that the Nazi who was in charge of the final solution was an ordinary and rather uninteresting bureaucrat who had no particular hatred of Jews and was in possession of a normal conscience. The core concept on which she relied was the banality of evil, the idea that when human beings in administrative bureaucracies commit atrocities, they are not typically motivated by malevolent motives or the desire to increase suffering in the world. Instead, their motives are commonplace, like the desire for promotion or to avoid embarrassment or to respect the authority of higher status members of their in-group. Many years after reading Arendt's account of the Eichmann trial, I was asked to do a book review of her lifelong correspondence with Karl Jaspers, the existential psychologist and philosopher, who was one of her teachers in Germany before the war. Reading those letters, it became apparent that it was Jaspers' brow from which the idea of the banality of evil originally sprung full-blown. Avishai knew this, obviously, for a long time. I didn't know this till I did that review. As early as October 19, 1946, Jaspers writes to Arendt, urging on her the view that, quote, a guilt that goes beyond all criminal guilt inevitably takes on a streak of greatness, of satanic greatness, which is for me as inappropriate for the Nazis as all the talk of the demonic element in Hitler and so forth. It seems to me that we have to see all these things in their total banality. End quote. Today I'm going to look beyond the contrast between malevolent and banal intent. I examine actions and activities whose atrocious character we may find difficult to acknowledge because they have their origins in righteous and rousing motives, such as the pursuit of truth, justice, and the American way, which I trust you recognize as a Superman reference. David Brooks recently quoted Margaret Thatcher, who declared, quote, when good has to be upheld, when evil has to be overcome, Britain will take up arms. 2 times in my life, I've listened to the entire Tolkien trilogy read out loud. So I understand the force of those sentiments that lead us to ride through the night with God on our side, to do battle with the Dark Lord, and assume the mantle of moral guardians of the world. Nevertheless, the dark side of self-righteousness is my theme today. There is a demonic profundity to evil in our times, and it is not just the evil in banality. It's the terrible irony that in the post-colonial world, Satan has mastered the humanitarian save-the-world discourse of human rights crusades and is now adept at harnessing the good intentions of the righteous in the service of tyrannies that the righteous themselves do not acknowledge and perhaps don't even perceive. What do I have in mind? Those of you familiar with my essay, Shouting at the Hebrews, which is a defense of robust cultural pluralism, may have already guessed. Equal rights for all sexes, say no to forced genital cutting, is the gender equity position of contemporary anti-male circumcision groups in North America and Europe. These activist organizations hope to put an end to the circumcision of male minors, which they describe as genital mutilation and child abuse. They believe that the male surgery reduces sexual pleasure, is physically and psychologically harmful to boys, and a violation of several human rights, including the right to self-determination and the right to the preservation of physical integrity. In their efforts to abolish the practice, they are encouraged by the ubiquitous North American and European news reports, opinion pieces, and human rights advocacy literature denouncing customary female genital surgeries in Africa in precisely those terms, and by the ready embrace by legislators and several global organizations, too, of legal statutes criminalizing female genital surgeries for minors, and in some countries in Europe, even banning the procedure for adult women if those women are motivated by a desire to uphold their own ethnic traditions. Simply put, the gender equity argument of the anti-male circumcision groups runs as follows. There should be equal protection for girls and boys before the law. If you are an outspoken critic of female genital mutilation, but then remain silent about male genital mutilation, you are either biased against men or a hypocrite. That gender equity argument plays relatively well in countries such as Holland, Sweden, Denmark, and Germany, where neither boys nor girls are customarily circumcised. In 2010, the Royal Dutch Medical Association, striving for logical consistency with respect to the issue of gender equity, issued an official policy statement decrying the quote-unquote non-therapeutic circumcision of male minors and calling on Muslims and Jews in Holland to abandon the practice. One of their main announced reasons for speaking up at this time was, quote, the growing sentiment that there is a discrepancy between the Medical Association's firm stance with regard to female genital mutilation and the lack of a stance with regard to the non-therapeutic circumcision of male minors, as the two have a number of similarities. In anticipation of the common and predictable retort that male circumcision may offer some distinctive protection against HIV infection, the Royal Dutch Medical Association offered this reply with a strong emphasis on the general autonomy and physical integrity rights of both males and females, quote, insofar as there are medical benefits, which they had some doubts about, such as a possibly reduced risk of HIV infection, it is reasonable to put off circumcision until the age at which such a risk is relevant and the boy himself can decide about the intervention or can opt for any available alternatives, like condoms or being selective in your sexual partners. 2 years later, male circumcision was banned in parts of Germany. Constitutional rights of general applicability, gender-inclusive rights to self-determination, physical integrity, and freedom from harm were invoked by an appellate judge in Cologne in a 2012 court decision criminalizing the circumcision of male minors as customarily practiced by Muslims and Jews. The German court decision concerned a Muslim 4-year-old and a Muslim doctor, although Jewish communities and organizations around the world were quick to react. They successfully lobbied German politicians to legislatively overturn the decision, despite German popular opinion strongly opposed to male circumcision, and with much of that popular opinion appealing to modern, secular, liberal human rights principles of the sort invoked by the judge in Cologne and the physicians in Holland. The Jewish reaction was hardly surprising, given the Jewish experience in Germany and their historical status as a circumcising minority group living in the midst of a non-circumcising German nation. In his book, Making the Body Beautiful, A Cultural History of Aesthetic Surgery, Sander Gillman remarks, quote, recently there's been a resurgence of the debate about male circumcision that had marked the first generation of German Reform Jewish thinkers in the 1840s. The most radical of these, Samuel Holdheim, had unsuccessfully advocated the abolition of infant male circumcision in Germany as a sign of the modernity of Jewish belief. The image of circumcision as a form of barbaric bloodletting dominated this discussion in the 19th century. It appeared in the rationale for the ritual murder accusations in the 1890s that Jews ritually slaughter non-Jewish children for their blood. The argument ran, if the Jews will do this to their own children, imagine what they'll do to ours. At the end of the 20th century, Gillman says, the accusation has resurfaced in the identification of circumcision as a form of child abuse. A further and even more dreadful historic irony of the recent court decision in Cologne was not lost on the collective memory of many Jews around the world, namely the ghastly incongruity of witnessing post-World War II constitutionally granted rights to self-determination, physical integrity, and freedom from harm, which were inspired by the ethical lessons of the Holocaust and Nazi-era medical experiments, invoked by a liberal German judge with the aim of eradicating a ritualized surgical procedure central to Jewish ethnic identity. The peoples of the world are quite divided in their social norms for genital cutting. And the typical European pattern, where neither boys nor girls modify their genitals, is not a cultural universal. There are no ethnic groups anywhere in the world where only girls modify their genitals. But there are many where both boys and girls do, and even more where genital modification is exclusively a male prerogative, such as the United States, Israel, South Korea, the Philippines, most of the West Asian Muslim world, and many ethnic groups in sub-Saharan Africa. In those countries, the gender equity argument of male circumcision groups plays much less well. Not surprisingly, arguments abound in the United States claiming in one way or another that the differences between female and male genital surgeries overwhelm any similarities, and that justice requires that different cases should be labeled and treated differently. According to the local dominant cultural attitude in the United States, the customary modification of female genitalia is savage, ugly, unnatural, misogynist, harmful, disgusting, and basically horrifying. In the popular imagination, it is the kind of thing barbarians do in Africa, where, as the nightmare scenario about the Dark Continent envisions, they maim, murder, and torture their own daughters and deprive them of the capacity for sexual pleasure. While the customary modification of male genitalia is thought to be normal and health-promoting, and is said to improve the human body, the way it looks, smooth and shapely, without any fleshy encumbrance, the way it feels, clean, and the way it works, reducing premature ejaculation. Imagine the reaction of the readers of the New York Times if the lawyers and language use editors of the newspaper should ever adopt a gender-equitable naming policy and begin referring to Jewish circumcision as male genital cutting, or start describing the circumcision ceremony of observant Jews held on the 8th day after the birth of a son as an occasion for male genital mutilation. A rather different sort of equity argument has currencies in countries such as Egypt, Ethiopia, Mali, Sierra Leone, parts of Malaysia, northern Sudan, where it's the dominant cultural view that males and females should be treated alike by modifying the genitals of both, and where the vast majority of females, approximately 80 to 90% in 7 African countries, would be deeply troubled by the exclusion of females from the practice. The argument that holds sway for them is one of moral equity between male and female, so that both traditions of genital modification are honored and preserved. Meanwhile, within human rights organizations and educated elite networks in North America and Europe, the voice of these women is rarely heard. Instead, the inflammatory rhetoric of mutilation, child abuse, female castration, sexual blinding, torture, war against women is preemptive, accusatory, and argument-ending, and effectively silences debate. It misleads even typically skeptical public intellectuals and journalists to think there can't be any other side to this story. It closes down the process of critical reasoning and fact-checking, thereby making it easy for inaccurate and hyperbolic claims to be uncontested and blatant falsehoods to go uncorrected, or if contested and corrected, to be not heard, or if heard, to be ignored and forgotten. Strong moral conclusions are compelled by the very language used in the conversation, which really isn't a conversation at all, but rather a self-affirming and more often than not self-righteous accusation, which functions to demonize others and proclaim the moral superiority of the speaker as a good person. Anti-abortion activists begin their conversations this way: are you now or have you ever been in favor of the murder of innocent life? Anti-circumcision activists begin them this way: are you now or have you ever been in favor of mutilation and child abuse? No Western journalist wants to be accused of being part of a war against women or of aiding and abetting the mutilators of children, so the topic becomes a hot potato for journalists who thereby silently assist hegemonic mutilation discourse to limit any public challenge. The rhetoric alone has proved powerful enough to convince an educated public in North America and Europe that a form of barbaric bloodletting is customary among African people. The desirability of its eradication seems obvious, a no-brainer. I don't have time to go into the rather good scientific evidence showing that most of the assumptions about sexuality and health effects have been discredited in a serious academic literature, which is never conveyed to you by the health section of the New York Times. Let me conclude, given time limitations, with just one final comment. Perhaps the recent judicial decision in Cologne and the report of the Royal Dutch Medical Association are not harbingers of things to come. Perhaps the liberal equal rights for all sexes say no to forced genital cutting agenda of the anti-male circumcision advocates will never gain traction, just as the 19th century liberal agenda of some German Jews to give up male circumcision as a sign of their modernity and as a way to fully assimilate themselves into German society never gained traction. Perhaps the ethnic and religious minority groups in the United States, such as Jews, who have customarily circumcised their sons for thousands of years as a sign of their ethnic or religious identity will continue to be part of a circumcising majority in the United States and gain some protection from secular claims, whether valid or not, and they're mostly not valid, about the medical benefits of male circumcision. The disquieting alternative is that global feminism's highly polemical, uncontested, and insufficiently evidence-based eradication campaign targeting ethnic groups in Africa, labeling them mutilators of their daughters, and using global wealth and power to undemocratically criminalize their customs will become an increasingly effective moral and legal springboard for opponents of neonatal male circumcision, first in Europe and ultimately in the United States. Ancient and modern Jewish history is caution enough about the hazards of righteous, inflammatory rhetoric and the rush to make dark judgments about little-known others. The righteous face of evil already has a name in the social sciences. It's called Orientalism.
Thank you very much, Rick. I promised you a controversial presentation, and I think you lived up to your reputation. So thank you very much for that. I'm sure there are many people who want to get in on this discussion. Could I just get an indication from the organisers as to when this panel is meant to end? 4 o'clock? Oh, okay. So we have quite a bit of. Okay, so we have quite a bit of time. So I just wanted to make a one or two comments, and then I'll open it to questions and contributions from the floor. And as we said this morning, people could just identify themselves. That would be very helpful. So I think one of the themes that goes through all three presentations is the question of the relationship between ordinary people and evil. Ordinary evil, extraordinary evil, whether evil is indeed a process, an incremental process, as we heard this morning, or whether evil is something that really is fixed in these demonizing polarities, or whether, as Rick was just suggesting, evil is something that is generated by a hegemonic discourse. So I think this is one of the issues that has come out of our panel, using or starting off from European experience, but really obviously then relating back to the States, to Africa, and so on. A second, I think, interesting question, which hasn't maybe been addressed enough, is the role that gender plays in our considerations of evil. But I think it's come out quite clearly. I think, if I'm not wrong, most of the images that Linn showed were male. And I think that the sort of political evil is often represented in very male terms. But when we talk about sort of ordinary evil, and when we think about ideas about ordinary evil, it's very often a gendered concept, very often relates to questions about how we particularly treat girls and women. So that's a second theme which I think is very interesting in the reflections of our panel. And lastly, and I say this with a particular interest, I think that we have all had one thing in common, all the presenters so far and those to follow, which is that, of course, that we are all adults. But Rick raised the question of children, and other people have spoken to some extent about children. And I'd like us to consider to what extent some of these discussions might be different if we had the voices of children in the room, or at least in our presentations, and to what extent our own perspective as adults and parents and decision makers affects the conceptions that we might have of what constitutes evil. So with those comments, let me open the discussion to the floor. And could you please identify yourselves? Yes, you with the red T-shirt.
I'm Reg McKean of the Harvard Institute for Learning and Retirement, and I'm so angry that I will limit myself to one question that I've written down, which I will address to Professor Shweder. Do you think any of your comments show the demonization of your opponents in arguing this issue that you denounce? Do you think any of your comments display any degree of self-righteousness? Thank you.
I think one of the fascinating things when Satan turns ironical is that everyone's going to spend their time figuring out who's got who in this. And so if you'd like to make that move, you can. I'm simply trying to argue that if you're concerned about, in the case we heard about with regard to Palestinians and Israelis, one of the interesting features is there are two sides, and both of them do have access to politicians and media and international communities. What's happened with regard to the discourse I'm talking about is that African women, first of all, I would guess that if I did a survey in this room, the level of ignorance about the customary practice, its effects, the degree of commitment to that practice, even the history of colonial efforts to do exactly what is happening now, that is the Brits in Kenya, in the Sudan, in Nigeria in the 1920s, is not even known to you. And all of a sudden, people who are anti-essentialist become essentialist with regard to this topic. If I asked you to really discuss genital anatomy, I think everyone in this room would probably be roughly where I was when I took up this topic, which with have a folk theory of anatomy, which leads you to think that evidence that shows that African women are no more sexually impaired than European and American women, and indeed a study done in Florence with Ethiopian and Somalian women compared to Italian women showed them to have as rich, if not richer, sexual lives. These were women who had what are called stage 2 and stage 3 circumcisions, were no more sexually impaired, and you will not accept that evidence or any other evidence that has come along showing high levels of coitus, showing orgasm and so forth. So the point is, if you want to say that what I'm doing is being self-righteous, what I think I'm trying to do is to say, let's actually have something like a debate in which critical reason is part of it. If you want to call that evil, you can call it evil. I think it's sort of central to what academics and intellectuals try to do. What they don't do is close down conversation with rhetoric that already demonizes and puts anyone in a situation of being the bad person if you actually say, there's a little more to this story than you think.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, Josh.
Well, I think you just answered the question I was going to ask, because I actually just wanted clarification. Oh, I can just be loud. Am I loud?
No, here.
In hearing your presentation, I was wondering, were you opposed to the demonization that you see on both sides, or were you saying that there's one side here that's clearly in the right? And I think your answer is it's the demonization that you're opposed to, and not that you're necessarily saying the people who are opposed to circumcision of all kinds are necessarily wrong. Am I? Is that right?
I'm making my argument comes from a attempt to portray robust cultural pluralism in a way that is intellectually defensible. So I view myself as a universalist without the uniformity, okay? And I believe that if you bracket your own emotional responses, talk about gut reactions, this is an area where gut reactions are as intense as you can get, okay? I mean, just the very idea of imagining a genital surgery of the type they do in Africa produces all sorts of feelings of disgust or rage. We've already heard anger expressed. This is part of the way in which the hegemonic discourse keeps itself going with these emotions. I believe that if you actually do what Montaigne recommended in On the Barbarians, a classic essay I recommend to everybody, he basically said, hold on, bracket your emotions, do a little bit of work about understanding the native point of view, look at the local context. None of you probably even realize that there's actually an aesthetic ideal in these communities in which smooth and clean is preferred for both males and females. I'll bet most of you didn't even know there wasn't even a single society in the world in which only females do genital modifications. If wherever you find female genital modifications, there are male modifications as well. And all this is because of the hegemonic control of the information. We've heard a lot today about not noticing, about control of information. I'm guessing that almost every one of the processes that was talked about today, before it became you having those reactions, you can apply to yourself if you really think about the lists you've been seeing.
Thank you. So I have three people first. I'm going to take three questions, and then we have a whole, as somebody said, a forest of. So Homi was first, and then Professor Ross. And yes, 1, 2, 3.
Homi, Rick, I've heard you give this very impassioned speech now 2 or 3 times. And, the rhetoric of it I admire in some kind of satanic way. But just to use the metaphor. But, I do think that what you are really arguing for is a kind of pluralism. And it is a very on high, in a sense, hegemonic discourse itself. You are arguing, and I wish you would say that. I mean, I think that if we instead of genital cutting, if we took bicycles versus prams or something, you would, in 2 different cultures, I think you would give a same impassioned thing. So I think your real interest is in a kind of plural, open-ended relativism. But what I don't, there are 2 things that I find problematic. One, you're always I've heard you do this before, confronting audiences with their ignorance. You don't know. You don't know. You don't know that the audience doesn't know. First of all, that I think is offensive. But I'm very fond of you, as you know, but I do think it's offensive. I also think that there is very little that you ever actually say about both sides of the argument. You're a pluralist who only speaks from one side of the argument. And that we've been to many of us have been to many such discussions on this very contentious issue. And when we talked, both of us together at the American Psychoanalytic Association a few months ago, I think you said that actually one of the things that bugged you was that it's a very small percentage of women in Africa who resort to this practice. Now, indeed, if there is a very small percentage, that was you gave a percentage and you said that what irritated you particularly, irritation is too mild a form, but I think what you said was that you couldn't believe why something that was only either 18% or some small percent was blown out of proportion by Western feminists.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we've got that comment. Thank you so much. Could I take the other 2 comments? So I think you had your hand up, and then yes.
I don't want to make this session only be about genital mutilation. I don't want to make the session only about genital mutilation, but I think it does raise a more general question. I'd be happy to hear any of you talk about it, and it really has to do with the intersection of rationalization and unequal power. So in any society, when we have to ask this question of where do we find universal values, or is there a notion of progress, we confront this issue most starkly where we see a system being justified. The system is customary, it is a reflection, and it also perpetuates unequal power. It can be unequal power between genders, it can be unequal power between ethnic groups or racial groups or the like. And so what I'm a little suspicious of, Rick, but I think it applies to political systems as well, is any discourse of this sort where the defense of the status quo is still the defense of a society or a system in which there is a hegemonic group that exerts control. Now, what it would take, I think the interesting and open intellectual question, Rick, is to what extent are we to understand that practice as something that males impose on females, something that females resist, something that males impose on females that females accept because they accept the authority of males, and something that females wholeheartedly embrace. And I think that's a very, very difficult question to get at, and I do think it's being oversimplified in that regard.
Yeah, we have the third question, and then Rick will have an opportunity to answer, and then I would actually encourage people to address questions to the whole panel if possible. But please go ahead.
Thank you. I'd like to move the discussion a little bit away from how we use demonization to win or fight arguments and move back to something that was quite striking for me that Ghazi brought up at the beginning of his talk, where he maybe didn't mean to, but he offered what felt to me like a definition of witnessing evil. And you described it as a gut-wrenching, life-changing experience. You described it as if a spiritual amputee having to live again, which I found very powerful, so I thank you for that description. And my question, if I could, for Ghazi and the other panelists is, could you, from your experience, just say a little more, describe a little more about such an experience of that sort for you?
Thank you so much. So, Rick, I think you have the first, if you would like to pick up the points you made, and then we'll move to Linn and Ghazi. And then we'll take
Homie,
some
I
more
love you
questions.
too. But as far as I recall, we've been together once, not 2 or 3 times doing this talk. I say, okay. Well, at that talk you referred to, I don't recognize the statement because, of course, there are 7 countries in Africa in which 80 to 90% of women endorse the practice, would want it for their own children, and we've heard about the complaints about 90% of Americans wanting gun control and the complaints about the politicians not doing it. What's happened throughout Africa is that a result of hegemonic power imbalances, wealth, pressure from international organizations, from donors, they have gotten lots and lots of African countries to pass statutes or policy statements criminalizing a practice that 80 to 90% of their own population approve of. Okay, so we're talking about, I can name all the countries, vast numbers, the majority clearly in several African countries, at least 7, endorse this practice, and they view it as deeply connecting them to their ancestors as Jews do to Abraham.
Okay.
With regard to gender imbalances, that also doesn't hold up. I mean, if your argument is the reason that we have to oppose this is because men are imposing it on women, that is not the case. And if you look at the variations in patriarchy across the societies, you're going to find that most patriarchal societies, even the most dominant ones, don't have these kinds of practices. You're going to find in West Africa, when explorers and Europeans met that part of the world, there was a higher percent of female chiefs, circumcised women, than there are women in the Senate in the United States today.
Rick,
Thank you so
with all due respect, that wasn't my point. My point was that this, I think in this case, it's quite unclear, with regard to the point I was making. I was saying it's a ubiquitous case that we see practices being justified that serve one group. I'm not saying necessarily the female genital mutilation or genital circumcision or alteration is such a case. I'm just saying there are many, many cases where we see practices justified, unequal treatment of women being a very typical one. It can be practices that relate to the way the environment is used. It can be treatments, conditions in our own society that justify particular practices. But what I'm saying is that this debate often occurs in the context of very unequal power. And it is the group with less power, as much as the group with more power, that tends to justify and rationalize the status quo. And so it's the issue of how much and when should we privilege the status quo that I think is the difficult issue, because we all embrace the notion that there can be progress in our moral sensibilities. We all try to articulate what those principles might be.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I would just add from the chair here that we are familiar with the history of foot binding, and there are discussions about now trying to stop corporal punishment, which is also very widespread and very widely accepted. So I think that this unequal dynamic, even between parents and children, might be something to look at. But Ghazi, would you like to, and then Linn, maybe take up the other point made about what it is like to confront evil?
Yes, thank you, Jackie. It seems that the discussion is focused on mutilation, spiritual or genital. Thank you very much for the question. The ancient Greeks, the Platonic school at least, consider knowledge like a road to happiness. But sometimes knowledge of evil through confronting it maybe it's not a road to happiness. It can complicate your life and maybe the lives of the others. So that's why I wanted a little bit to transform the affirmative form of this conference, Confronting Evil, in an interrogative. Confronting evil? Are people really, do they have curiosity to confront evil always? Maybe they wage a huge amount of energy to avoid confronting evil, to hide evil through this kind of fragmentation. Or they wage a huge amount of energy to convince themselves that they don't need to confront evil because they belong to the good. So confronting evil, according to me, brings a kind of let's say, of spiritual crisis, of knowledge crisis, of crisis of identity. Sometimes, for me, to go back to and to not steal a lot of minutes, to go back to my work as a writer, talking with perpetrators and with victims has been a very painful process. Painful process where I questioned a lot of things that I got for granted, especially confronting the perpetrators. And I understood how much we need to convince ourselves that evil and evildoers comes from an orbit which don't belong to our normal orbit. They are monsters, totalitarian regimes. We don't know how they existed. We have forgotten them very easily. And that is a whole process that we should think about evil not as something extraordinary, but as something existing in common circumstances also.
Lynn, would you like to say something?
Yeah, I'd actually like to address Lee Ross's point on power asymmetry in evil. And I have three aspects to the answer. I'm thinking in the context of Israel-Palestine here in particular. The first point is that I think in terms of inequality and in power asymmetry, we tend to think about it in material terms, but it can also be perceptual. And in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, what's interesting is we see both sides of the conflict seeing themselves as being part of the power asymmetry. The Palestinians see themselves as being occupied, as being dispossessed, as not being able to, as being powerless. And we can make a case for their power asymmetry very clearly between the Israelis and the Palestinians. But the Israelis on their side see themselves, and we often know about this David and Goliath image of the Israelis seeing themselves as an island, a lonely island in the region of the Middle East. So in that sense, it's very difficult to talk about power asymmetry, or it's challenging because there are the notion and the perceptions of both sides. That's my first point. My second point is about just on the very practical level, when I was collecting examples of Israeli and Palestinian demonization, there was a visible power asymmetry in terms of how to gain access to information. So there we do see a case of power asymmetry, and I'm talking in particular here about the notion of when I gathered Palestinian examples of demonization, in fact, there is a stockpile of Israeli monitoring groups that get very, very strong resource fundings to gather examples of Palestinian demonization. There are lots of websites. One, for instance, is the Palestinian Monitoring, Palestinian Media, PMW. Watch. There, thank you very much. And so in that sense, it was more easy to gather examples of Palestinian demonization. Now that brings the tricky question, well, maybe there is more. Palestinian demonization, but it might also be a question of resources as well, where we don't have as many examples gathered and translated on the Palestinian side. Finally, then, the third point is that at the same time, that being said, demonization is a discourse. In that sense, it can be both hegemonic, but it can also be the weapon of the weak. So we do see demonization across power asymmetries because of this notion that demonization is a discourse.
Thank you. I'm going to take a cluster of 3 questions. So the lady at the back, did you still want to ask your question? No, not so much. Okay. So Susan, Luis, and Mazrin.
I'm really concerned about Rick's concept of pluralism. And mea culpa, if you like, I'm one of those people who doesn't know much more about genital cutting than what I read in Ayaan Hirsi Ali's books. So let's get off that subject for a second and take 2 others. I'm less interested in the question of power than the old-fashioned word false consciousness. There are millions of women in the world who raise their daughters in the deep belief that they should not get an education, that they should, live subservient to their men, and that is women's place in the world, and that is part of their culture. But I even want to get away from that example and ask you about the following. Part of what I take to be my job in Berlin is explaining to the Germans this crazy world of the USA. And, I've usually been able to do pretty well until we got to the healthcare debate. And then what I had was, really very intelligent and Philo-American people coming to me and saying, I don't understand. They're, up in arms because someone wants to give them health care. And I, started trying to explain, this is this American culture of self-reliance, and certain people feel that. At a certain point, I gave up and I said, you're right, they are crazy.
So, Susan, your question.
Well, the question is, does your view of pluralism leave any room for a notion of false consciousness and the possibility that people might just be wrong?
Thank you. Okay, can you hold that, Luis? I'm going to take 3 questions.
Yeah, I have a small reference to Rick, but my question is to Mrs. Norman. Because my feeling was Rick is presenting, and thank you for shaking up after lunch, is the idea there are issues for the group and they're universal issues. I have to be careful not to intrude in the group with something that's not universal. And healthcare could be one of them. It's local, it's US. And for me, the issue, what are the universals? And that's connected with you because you were proposed de-demonize in order to negotiate. But Hitler is pretty universal, I think. So imagine 1944, stop the war, deal with Hitler. Hitler cannot be in Russia because he was defeated, but still dominate Europe and keep the Jewish and keep whatever. Is there a limit for this de-demonization? Can we do that? What's the limit to de-demonize? Because basically the victims, as you say, are using the demonization to show, hey, we're the victim, he's the criminal, or he's the killer. So what are the limits? And probably, if we can define that, could be universal values, and then we discuss with Rick.
Thank you very much. Mazrin.
These 2 questions go together, and mine's different, so maybe they should answer.
Okay, so we have 2 questions. First of all, is there such a thing as false consciousness, or can people be wrong? And secondly, what is the limit to demonization? So why don't we start with Linn?
It's a good question, and it's a difficult question. It does force us to think about, on the one hand, going back to definitional aspects of what is evil and what do we have to do to stop it. And I'm not going to in any way provide a defense here, a cultural relativist defense of Hitler. I mean, I'm not going to say that, there has to be limits. And what I hope I wasn't presenting was a form of a naive portrayal of de-demonization is something necessary for all conflicts. I think at some point it is necessary to take a stance, and it is necessary to recognize evil, whether we call it evil or not, this notion that we have to bring it to justice. So what are the limits to de-demonization? Yeah, I'm stuck. I am.
Do you
Because
want to offer some thoughts on this? You have thought about this long and hard. You will later. Okay, fine. Well, you can come back, Linn.
Yeah,
this is a very tough question, so you can come back and feel free just to jump in. Rick, would you like to take up Susan's question?
I think that there's room for a concept of false consciousness. In fact, part of my talk is to try and make you aware of the massive amount of false consciousness that's involved in the current judgments that are going on, in which attributions of barbarisms are being made to Africa. So, for example, if someone says, we've got to stop this because they're depriving these girls of their capacity to have an orgasm or to have sexual pleasure, that's false consciousness because it's not true. So I'm okay. Well, I mean, all right, then I have to hear more about false consciousness. I thought it's being aware of something and it's false. Okay, so or you think that in any case, I believe that what?
It means the disadvantage in something, adopting the position of the advantage.
But the position of the advantage has to be false, presumably. You don't see it as adopting valid things from experts.
No.
I think it's adopting for a disadvantaged person to adopt and incorporate the position of the advantage without recognizing that that's what they're doing. So it's a Marxist concept.
Well, I mean, this is a much broader issue about whether or not you have hierarchies of knowledge and experts know more than people adopt things that experts tell them. And indeed, I certainly think there are all those processes. I think that when it comes time to moral disagreements, Cardinal Newman said when we disagree with each other, either our disagreements are trivial or insurmountable. And what he meant by the trivial was it's just a matter of error, ignorance, or confusion. So my goal is, when you have disagreements, to try and correct error, ignorance, and confusion. One or the other parties may be suffering from error, both may, and you see what comes out of it. That's one of the reasons for encouraging a more open debate about this topic. By the way, the Hastings Center report just published in November a group statement trying to correct the one-sided, hyperbolic kinds of characterizations that are out there in the press, and I would recommend it to all of you.
I brought up two other examples to get off the topic of
I think that it's quite possible for there to be differences in the world in conceptions of gender, in conceptions of sexual relations, in conceptions of the relationship of work to family. I think there are enormous areas in which these fundamental existential issues do not lend themselves to a single answer.
But Rick, I think, could you just address the question?
I certainly think there are things that are out of the question. What?
I mean, take the question of girls' education. Do you think that would you have the same answer to that? That really it's up to communities to decide, it's up to parents to decide, to withdraw their girls from school at 9. That's just really...
I'm not going to make I certainly think that to keep people ignorant, have them have no skills, to make it impossible to have an important and valued place in society would be a wrong. However, that does not translate into everyone has to go to college the way I did. That doesn't even translate into everyone has to develop the same set of skills in a public school.
But it does
I do not believe. I think sexual differentiations are different in different societies, and there are sensible and adaptive reasons for them. So I would not take the model that you have growing up in the United States and imagine the whole world has to be that way.
Okay, thank you.
Right,
yeah. Okay, Masreen.
Oh, this is for Ghazi. Ghazi, you are probably unique in this room in that you've had the experience of confronting people you perceive to be and were monsters. And so the question I have for you comes from lots of evidence that we collect on ordinary people who've never had to do that. And we notice that when somebody achieves power, that even those who consciously dislike those folks will, at some implicit level, grow to have a positive feeling. And the simplest example I can give you is that Democrats who explicitly say that they hate George Bush after each of the 2 elections in which George Bush won, showed at the level of an implicit preference a greater liking for Bush on our tests of unconscious preference, even though they would denounce him consciously. Do you know if, in your experience confronting these folks, that you may have left in some way with a more implicit positive view of them than you went in with?
This is
a form of false confidence.
This is a very essential question, because this is a question that I was making to myself sometimes, in the sense that I was questioning myself if I am understanding them more than I should understand them. Are they? Am I identified with them? When I say, for example, that I would have liked to look at the world or at the private library of the tyrant with the same eyes that the tyrants did, at which point should my identification go? If I was listening to them and sometimes I was repressing myself by reacting, I had this moral issue of, what are you doing? You are listening to someone who is lying or is justifying his crimes. Should you sit with him at a common table? Should you record him? Are you? And this is what I talked about, the identity crisis. But this is the price that you have to pay if you want to confront the evil. There is in the Balkans, there are these pre-modern healers. They were females usually, who used to heal someone who had the evil by taking the evil inside themselves and destroying it. But sometimes there was said that the evil could have killed them because it was unbearable. So this is a risk that you have to decide if you have to take or not. I remember, for example, I don't regret that I took this risk, because I learned a lot of things, and I haven't taken this risk only with the concrete persons, characters. For example, one of the things that I wanted to do in Greece when I was living there was to make personal interviews with the neo-Nazi. I want to understand the way they think, the clothes they wear, the food they eat, their parents, where they live, how they see the world. It doesn't mean that I justify them. But I think that it's maybe a paradox to say it enriches me, but it makes me as a writer or as a researcher able to explain the evil better. Afterward, otherwise, there is a very simple solution. You belong to the world of non-evil, so you know what evil is, and you have to denounce it. As a human rights activist, I have to denounce it, and I denounce it. But as a writer, as a researcher, as something more, I have this curiosity to go there and to try not to bargain with evil, but to confront it.
Okay, so 1, 2 at the back near the window, and 3. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Eugene Kogan, Brandeis University. Dr. Kapllani, I also grew up in a totalitarian society. I grew up in Russia. And I am intrigued by your challenge. Whether it's confronting evil or it's confronting evil, it's a question.
Yeah.
And my question is about responsibility to negotiate, to confront for those who grow up with evil. Because not everybody, as you say, does that. Not everybody feels that it is responsible to negotiate with evil, to confront it. Not everybody feels safe enough, courageous enough to do so. Not everybody is a Sharansky, not everybody is like you. And this question really cuts across from your presentation to Dr. Norman's in that it takes two to demonize, right? It takes those who want to demonize, and it takes the audience to be acceptant of it enough to be demonized. So to what extent is it really a question of a responsibility of us, the audience, to know when we are being manipulated with these images that you mentioned? So can you talk about this idea of responsibility to us, to the people around us, to future generations?
Thank you very much. Yeah, question near the window. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Brooke McGowan. I'm a visiting fellow here. I'm at the University of Cambridge in the UK. I wanted to make a couple of comments. Comment number one, I missed the first panel, so excuse me if I'm wrong about this, but certainly in this afternoon panel between the later morning one, there seems to have been this ontological and theological turn, which is very interesting. If you listen to the arguments in the previous panel, they were very existentialist, being that there is no such thing as an evil person. There is an act which can be evil or not evil or good. And now in this very practical sense where we're saying, okay, how do we respond to the witnessing of events, whether they be human rights abuses, acts of war, etc., which is in a sense very realistic and not theoretical. Suddenly we have this very reified concept of evil that seems to be placing itself without necessarily can be perceptual or creative or productive in that sense, without being looked at as purely existentialist. Although I would say to Linn's talk that in a sense that being creative is in some sense existentialist. But
is that a question or comment?
No, it's a question of kind of why, in the actual witnessing, do we suddenly revert to this question, to this essentialist category, in the actual witnessing. Now, in the second comment is actually a suggestion to a question that was oriented to Linn, which is in Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil. There's a suggestion that there was previously a category of good and bad, which had to do with action, and a category of good and evil that has taken over that difference between priestly and knightly classes, et cetera, et cetera. But my suggestion to the question of what are the limits of de-demonization is that I think the question is a question of justice, whether or not justice is possible. And I don't think that there is a limit to de-demonization, because if you don't de-demonize someone like Hitler, then you have no idea how Hitler came to be. This goes back to the psychological question of how do we create monsters? Anyway, but you
thank you. Okay, good. So we'll take those two comments on board, and then the last question here. Yeah, thank you.
For Mr. Kapllani, my name is.
Hang on a second.
Sure. I'm Linda Kapllani from the Kennedy School. I wanted to go back to your quote. Paraphrasing you, once a totalitarian regime is in place, ordinary people are at risk of becoming perpetrators, if I've got it correct. Many of us in this room have been watching as certain fundamental civil rights that we've taken for granted our whole lifetime. For instance, Miranda rights when you're arrested, norms against torture, trial by jury have eroded over time. And I'm wondering if indeed being bystanders while things like that happen actually is a signal about totalitarianism coming into place as opposed to the other way around. In other words, as the justification for those types of policy actions are given to us based on our most base fears, the fear of insecurity, of terror, and so on. Actually, we are sliding down a slope where a totalitarianistic type regime is coming into being while we are standing by and watching that. And very quickly, as a field researcher who has interviewed many people who have committed evil acts, mostly organized crime members, in work that I did in the 1990s and early part of this century, I think it's absolutely necessary for us to empathize with the person we're talking to at the moment of the conversation. Because if we don't, then it is impossible to make the connection that allows for them to reflect about their own processes, right? Even when they believe what they did was right and so on. It's the difference, I think, as a researcher between that kind of slow and fast thinking, which is at the moment, my gut instinct is to see their humanity, and when I move away from them and am writing about it and doing my analysis, it's the slow thinking where they resume their position as opposed to their humanness, and I can see them for what they are. So I don't think that it's that dangerous. It just means that as a researcher or interviewer, we have to have the dual consciousness of in the presence of and outside the presence of.
Thank you. That's very helpful. So we have three questions, one about responsibility, one about de-demonization, and one about bystanders and slow and fast thinking. So who'd like to jump in here? Ghazi.
Well, it seems that I am the most courageous to confront the evil.
We're just giving Rick a rest.
Thank you very much for all the questions. In terms of if it is so dangerous or not, it depends on the context. I am interviewing some people under which I lived 24 years of my life. I mean, if you lived in South Africa and were a victim of apartheid, and then you were a researcher or a writer, and you should interview one of the perpetrators, it's not the same. The context is very, I think it's always we should put things in a context. My emotional involvement with the concrete people won't be the same if I have talked to, I don't know, if they were alive, to Beria, to Khrushchev, to Stalin, or whoever else. And what I noticed talking to them, not to all of them, but to some of them, they still thought that they didn't belong to the camp of the evil. Some of them wanted to convince me that they were doing good. Maybe they didn't do, especially communism is a special case in the sense that the victims and the evildoers sometimes not only they belong to the same people, but sometimes they changed roles. And that's why, especially after the collapse of the communism, there was this sense and this feeling that we were guardians and prisoners at the same time. Because I have to finish by saying that the temptation of good is an enemy of let's say of democracy. The temptation of good, by the incarnation of good. If you think that you are the incarnation of good, You are the warrior who will, because these guys, some of them, they imagine themselves like warriors who were waging war on evil. They were totally, that they incarnated a good ideology. And when you incarnate a good ideology, then you don't see the consequences, because the individual is not a name per se, a name in itself. It becomes a tool. And
very quickly,
now
we're running out of time.
I have the responsibility to say that I have the responsibility of the time, and I if you want, we can talk.
Okay,
afterwards.
so Linn, just like a couple of
I'll
sentences,
be very quick,
and Rick, a couple of sentences.
Quickly on the audience question, I think that's a very important aspect, and you pointed out a dual relationship between the demonizer and the demonized, but in a way, it's a three-dimensional relationship between the demonized, the demonizer, and the audience. And you mentioned this notion of responsibility. I think an important question when we come to responsibility is the distinction between instrumental demonization and normative demonization, where on the one hand, demonization is used, you use the term manipulation as a tool, in which case the audience might be aware of its constructive purposes, whilst in normative demonization, you might not even have awareness of demonization, but you just accept it as a belief system, and that's where demonization can become particularly difficult or dangerous. And that brings me just now coming back to Luis Moreno Ocampo's question of de-demonization, now that I've been reflecting on it, and this points to the comment that was made earlier, is this distinction between good and bad versus good and evil. And the point is, when you take the discussion to a level of evil, you bring it into a metaphysical realm that takes it out of, say, Schmidt's idea of the friend and enemy, right? When you say good and evil, you bring it into the realm of the divine, and you take it out of human being responsibility. And so I'm trying to point out to, the problem with trying to find out where the limit goes is it presents it as a scale. And perhaps it isn't a scale. Perhaps it is a question of a paradigm shift. So I'll leave my comments to that, and then we can discuss it later.
Just a couple of concluding observations, please.
Well, only that I've long recognized that I have one foot in the Enlightenment and one foot in the Romantic Rebellion against the Enlightenment, or one foot with the Maccabees and one foot with the Hellenized Jews who sided with those who tried to close down Torah-based practices among the Jews. And of course, I look at the world now, and you see the evil empire facing the great Satan, and on one side we're the great Satan, and they are the evil empire. At least as an anthropologist, my move is to at least try to actually see whether or not you can accurately understand the other. Maybe that won't work, maybe it will. I can tell you right now, if you start reading newspapers in places like Sierra Leone, the representation of the humanitarian effort and the money coming in trying to get rid of what they see as a Western conspiracy to get rid of a long-standing African practice is articulated. Okay, and I sometimes, more recently, have begun to think that if you go back and you read Abraham, you read Genesis 17, you read various things in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, the relationship between Sarah and Hagar is looming large, and right now you have third world women who view themselves as the daughters of Hagar, and we have international feminists who view themselves as the daughters of Sarah, and they have very different views of the world.
Thank you so much, and thank all of you for being part.